Following on from last episode and the joy of Kelsier giving birth, we return to the crew to see some of the unexpected side effects of Kelsier's recent absence. With Kelsier out travelling and then immediately bedbound following the birth, Brom had been left to do the cooking, which led to some very foreseeable outcomes. Determined to reduce the blackouts that the crew had experienced during the night time as a result of their solar-based power grid, Brom suggested incorporating a small chem fuel powered generator into their grid. They were already producing a lot of chem fuel, most of which was going to storage, so it made sense to use some of it to power a small 24/7 power source. Progress was feeling increasingly slow, and the crew ended the day with very little to show for their efforts. The ship was no closer to being built, and most of the time had been spent trying to mine materials to continue the build. Thankfully, Jay and the commander were able to keep morale up by finishing another research project. With the ability to create a navigation console, they moved on to understanding how to build heat sinks. The ship would need heaters in order to keep it at a livable temperature. However, given that the hull would need to insulate them from the freezing temperatures of the vacuum of space, it would also keep all the heat in. If they didn't control this heat properly, it could lead to them cooking alive inside the ship. A heatsink would be vital to allow them to vent the excess heat into the vacuum in order to avoid this. Just as the crew were waking up, a rain of fire and debris began crashing down upon the peninsula. It appeared as though two ships had engaged in some sort of combat just above the planet's atmosphere, and pieces of the damaged ships were falling out of orbit and raining down upon the planet. This was extremely dangerous. There was no telling where the next piece of debris would land, and if it hit one of the crew, there wasn't much they could do about it. If they all survived, however, it could prove to be a useful boon, as many of the ship chunks that would crash down could be dismantled for parts to help them build their own ship. Some poor unfortunate souls survived their fall from the ship battle into the planet, with injuries that could theoretically be remedied. However, the commander was too conscious of the danger involved in approaching them to allow the crew to rescue anyone. He couldn't risk somebody being hit by falling debris. With some of the materials from the fallen ship chunks at their disposal, Brom was finally able to continue work on their own ship, finishing more of the wall sections and even filling out some of the floor of the hull. She had also managed to build the first solar panel on the ship. It was only a small thing, but it felt like a great success to all of the crew. The ship was now technically producing power. In fact, in order for the rest of the ship's proposed solar panels to fully extend, they would need to deconstruct one of the static solar panels. Contrary to what you might think, this felt like good news to the crew. They could replace the lost power from the static panel with the two new ones on the ship, and could even use some of the components from the static panel for this purpose. With the hull finally taking shape, the commander began to plan out the location of a few of the basics of the ship. The minimum number of advanced components required for just the life support system would be 12, a ridiculous amount compared to what they had managed to source so far. This is where the real difficulty would lie in their plans. Preparing plans for the life support and the pilot's console in the first room was part of the contingency the commander was planning. The ideal situation would see them in a ship large enough to sustain them for weeks, or perhaps indefinitely. There was no telling how long it may take them to find a safe location to land. However, in the worst case scenario, the commander would settle for a tiny ship, so long as it could get them off the planet before it was destroyed. If that had to be the case, then they would figure out how to survive in space once they got there. With that in mind, if this single small room could fit everything they would need to take flight, then that would be the worst case scenario prepared for. Finishing up their research into heat sinks, the research team moved on to researching capacitor arrays. Ships could require a lot of power, and as this one would be solar powered, it would be important to store power when they could. Capacitor arrays stored far more than batteries and were more efficient. They would need a few of these on the ship to help survive the trip. With still almost a year to go before the planet killer weapon reached them, Brom suggested that they would have plenty of time to build a larger hull for the ship, allowing for a more comfortable experience. The primary difficulty would be building the ship's systems, not the hull. The commander agreed and directed them to place down an extra room in the ship, although this first required extending the perimeter wall. In hindsight, they may have chosen a less than ideal location to start the building of the ship. With their research into capacitors complete, the research team moved on to trying to understand hydroponics. These would be vital if the crew were to reach their ideal situation, as it would allow them to produce food and other plant-based materials aboard the ship while they travelled. If they wanted to be able to survive for a long time up there, they would need hydroponics. With the ridiculous amount of advanced components it would take to create the life support system, and many other systems in the ship, the commander instructed Tercio to begin crafting their own advanced components, using gold, plasteel, and steel that they had mined from the surrounding area. Despite this command, Tercio wasn't showing any signs of making any progress in this task. The commander figured that maybe he needed a larger, more sophisticated fabrication bench in order to achieve his goal, so began clearing out additional space in the chem fuel storage area, in which to place down a larger bench. However, he soon realised that the real issue was far greater than that. Crafting advanced components requires a crafting skill of 12. Tercio just didn't have the skill required to make advanced components, and, despite his skill in crafting, he wasn't exactly passionate about it. The commander was devastated, but he knew how to handle this. Tercio was assigned to crafting rocks and to throwing rocks until he managed to acquire the finesse that would be required to make advanced components. It looks like it's time for a montage. While Tercio was busy having his montage moment, this left the crew with other problems. Tercio was the best miner in the group, but with him focused solely on crafting for the time being, they would be even more restricted on materials than before. The others would need to step in to pick up some of the slack, otherwise by the time Tercio was ready to craft the components, they wouldn't have any of the materials required for them. As they began to plan out the new room for the ship, the crew realised that they would require more space than initially thought, and planned to move the perimeter wall out even further. They were careful not to remove the old wall section until the new one was built, however. No one wanted a surprise group of raiders to just walk straight into the base. The initial idea behind the second room was that it would be a storage area. The first room alone didn't give them much space to actually store anything, and they were hoping to stockpile some meals on the ship before they left. With the commander helping pick up some of the slack on the mining side of things, Jay was left to handle the research on his own. They had completed plenty of their research projects though, so were no longer concerned about that holding them back. Jay began researching ship shields. Shields were vital for surviving ship-based combat, however, the commander was hoping they would be small enough to stay under the radar of any ships looking for trouble, so researching shields was mostly a just in case. 2 days into Tercio's montage, the commander decided it would benefit them to send a caravan to Studybut again. His primary hope was that they could pick up a skill trainer which would instantly give Tercio the boost he needed. But, failing that, perhaps they could pick up some more advanced components to let them continue with the ship construction while they waited for him to learn. As one of their better traders, the commander himself set out on this journey. In the commander's absence, Brom oversaw the further expansion of the perimeter wall to allow for the increasing size of the ship. As she did so, the wisdom of not demolishing the old wall until the new one was complete came to be shown. A large raid approached the base. The raiders were tribal and equipped with a few ranged weapons, but nothing that would likely compete with the crew's guns. The crew took up their defensive positions and laid down a barrage of bullets. Some of the raiders got a little close, but they never really stood a chance. With Tercio's montage well underway, the crew had an abundance of throwing rocks, which seemed to have no value to traders. As a result, they designated an area on the beach outside where they could leave the rocks to deteriorate. Arriving at Studybut, the commander is saddened to find that they don't have the skill trainer he was hoping for, but he does manage to pick up 2 advanced components before heading home. Upon returning, the commander utilises the 2 advanced components he'd picked up to build the larger fabrication bench. Although this won't speed up their ability to create their own advanced components, it will allow them to build EVA suits. Sadly, EVA suits also require advanced components, leaving them out of reach for the time being. That day, a meteor of pure solid gold falls nearby. This meteor should provide enough gold that they no longer need to use the deep drill to extract some from beneath the ground. Following his earlier run-in with a bunch of rabid hares, Tavi had got an infection yet again. Either this man has a shockingly bad immune system, or he's just deathly allergic to small animals. Speaking of dangerous animals, as Brom was stuck inside the ship, filling out the hull of the second room, a lynx cornered her and moved in for the kill. This was a horribly dangerous situation. Brom had nowhere to run, and if she got knocked down, the lynx wouldn't be content to just leave her bleeding out. It wanted food, and it was going to make sure it got it. Despite his condition, Tavi ran from his room to the ship, desperate to save Brom. Before he could get there, Brom was knocked down, and the lynx began to feast. Thankfully, using his superior gun skills, Tavi was able to thread a few shots through the opening in the door and tag the lynx, causing it to shift its focus to him. Brom had taken a severe beating, but if they could get to her soon, she should survive. As Tavi lured the lynx away, Terciel immediately rushed in to help Brom. She would survive, although it was perhaps mostly due to her coagulator bionic. Without it, she may have bled out far before anyone could reach her. Although she would survive, it would take her some time to overcome the injuries. A group of sellswords arrived at the peninsula. They didn't have much to trade, but they were interested in the gold that the crew had accumulated from the meteor which had fallen to the peninsula. The crew were happy to part with some of it, in exchange for silver that they could use on future trading missions. Determined not to be the cause of any delays to their plans, Brom was soon back on her feet and finishing the hull in the second room of the ship. They had been unable to complete the hull in the first room as they couldn't build underneath the chemfuel tank, so they made plans to build a new tank in the second room, which they could then transfer the stored fuel into. This would allow them to dismantle the first tank and finally finish the floor of the hull in the first room. With the ship's fuel network planned, they could also begin to plan the ship's engines, starting with expanding the perimeter wall once more. With steel supplies becoming an ever-increasing issue, the crew saved up enough to create a smelter. This would allow them to generate usable steel from the chunks of steel slag littered around the peninsula, and they could do it at a far faster rate than digging up steel through the deep drills. They built some shelves in the second room, since it was supposed to be a storage room, and spent the last advanced component that they had to build the pilot's console. That was one more requirement ticked off the list, which was just the kind of win they needed, with the days ticking down. As Brom finally finished the floor of the hull in the main room, she began to plan out the engines. When they took off, the engines would cause an area of fire behind the ship, but given that they would never return to this planet again, as it was about to be blown up, it didn't matter very much whether the base burnt down after takeoff. In order to create the sensors that they would need to fly the ship, they first had to research long-range mineral scanners, so Jay set to work on that. Although they hoped to have space on the ship to grow food to sustain themselves, this would only likely be the outcome in the best case scenario. With that in mind, the commander directed Kelsier to begin creating packaged survival meals, which they could then stockpile on the ship. With Terciel still montaging away in the corner, the commander and Brom set off to Studybot once more, hoping for skill trainers or advanced components. Naturally, while the crew were down 2 people, is exactly when the raiders decided to strike. Arriving in drop pods, they oddly decided to land directly in Kelsier and Terciel's room once again. The raiders were well armed, but thankfully for the crew, they seemed much more interesting in trying to steal Kelsier and Terciel's baby than in fighting, allowing the crew to take them down quickly, saving both the baby and all of the furniture. Upon arriving at Studybot, the commander and Brom were dismayed to find that they have neither skill trainers nor advanced components for sale. Determined not to return empty-handed, they head off to the next nearest settlement that's willing to trade with them. It's a fair distance, but with mainly roads between them, it shouldn't take too long. Sadly, upon arriving at that settlement, named Larney Lake, there were still no skill trainers or advanced components. Heads low, they began to make their way back to the peninsula. Before the caravan could return, another raid arrived, this time comprised of Neanderthals. They had poor equipment, but were extremely hardy, so would require a fair bit of damage to put down. With Tavi feeling extremely unhappy, the others manned the defences, in the hopes that he wouldn't have to. But the raiders were taking a bit too long to put down, so Tavi joined them to try and speed up the process. With his help, they were soon able to put an end to the raid. Burning through what little hope they had left, the commander and Brom redirected their journey to visit Studybot once more on their way home. Maybe they might have some new stock to trade with. Sadly, this wasn't the case, and the caravan prepared to return home empty-handed. Determined not to let the crew down, the commander soon headed out again, hoping to find what they needed at a third settlement nearby. They loaded up the few furs that they had, along with a few of the bows which Tercia was now creating to practice his crafting, and the commander and Tavi set off north, towards the settlement of Evedenau. While the commander was away, a combat supplier's caravan approached the peninsula. Taking a short break from his crafting, Tercia went to trade with them. Being a combat supplier, they didn't have anything of great use to the crew for sale. However, they were happy to take a lot of the bows Tercia had crafted, and a number of the weapons they had taken from fallen raiders in exchange for some silver. Arriving at Evedenau, the commander was not able to source a skill trainer from them. However, they did have 6 whole advanced components, which the commander was able to buy with ease, thanks to their efforts in stockpiling what little silver they could. This wouldn't be enough to build the life support, but it would help them get a lot closer to building a functional ship. As bad news seems to follow bad, it would appear that good news also follows good, as shortly after returning from his trip with the advanced components in hand, the commander and Brom announced they were expecting a child. Finishing their research into basic ship sensors means that they now have all the research they need to build the ship. Jay moves on to another research project which would be nice to have, but might prove to be a little bit out of reach: artificial ecosystems. These are small, self-contained growth tanks which provide the water, sunlight, and nutrients that plants need to grow. Having them on the ship would be more efficient than building a sun lamp and separate hydroponics. Construction of artificial ecosystems would require yet more advanced components, however, so it was not incredibly likely that they'd be able to stock some in the ship in the next 30 days or so. Using the 6 advanced components the commander and Tavi brought back allowed Brom to build the basic sensors which the ship would need, but only just. This meant that they were still 12 advanced components away from being able to build life support, and even more to be able to build the last of the 2 solar panels to finish sealing in the hull. With the planet's remaining days becoming increasingly numbered, things were getting tense. But when the going gets tough, this crew gets going. Brom and the commander were both hard at work on the deep drills, pulling out steel and plasteel to stockpile for the build. Soon, the crew had 4 deep drills, 2 to extract plasteel, and 2 to extract steel. If ever any of the crew found themselves with nothing else to do, they were instructed to start drilling. It was all hands on deck from now on. As the crew were busy working away on stockpiling their supplies, a raid of tribespeople approached. Armed with a mixture of guns and grenades, this raid could pose quite the threat to the crew. The raiders prepared for some time before attacking, however there was little the crew could do to prepare for the attack, so they settled for making sure they were well rested. As the raiders finally began their approach, the crew took up defensive positions along the sandbags and prepared for quite a bloody encounter. Thankfully, despite the raiders toting a number of guns, they largely seemed to have a shorter effective range than the crew's guns, allowing them to pepper a number of the raiders as they approached while receiving little fire in return. The addition of a personal shield to one of the raiders was a cause for concern, however, as there was only one, the crew figured that if they could take out enough of the unshielded attackers, then they may be able to cause the shielded one to flee out of fear. The first grenade came sailing over the sandbags, so the crew began to retreat. All except Brom, that is, who unfortunately had to stop to vomit due to morning sickness, and was immediately blinded by the stun grenade and then clipped with a bullet. Thankfully, shortly after this, the raiders had taken enough losses and turned tail, literally, and fled. This left the crew somewhat well off, all things considered, with only Brom and Kelsier suffering some minor damage. Following the raid, the Commander Gardener put his hauler mechanoid to work. As they had never had the time nor resources to spare to build a charging station for it, it had mostly laid dormant, conserving power. However, it was quite useful once every few weeks to clear the corpses from the trenches. The sight and smell of tens of corpses didn't seem to upset it like they did the squishy crewmates. It seemed that the vibrations of the incoming planet killer were starting to really upset the local bugs. They began to break through the surface right next to the base's main solar panels. Thankfully, the insectoids were easily distracted by the solar panels, allowing the Commander and Tavi to pick them off carefully one at a time, before they could do any real damage. Finally, on the 6th of September of the second year, almost half a year since he started, Tercia's montage finally came to an end. he would now be able to produce advanced components directly, allowing them to finally progress the ship further. With only 30 days until the planet was destroyed, they were well and truly in the endgame now. There was a lot to achieve, and not a lot of time in which to achieve it. That just means it's time to get to work. Hey guys, Tuna here again, just haunting the end of the video as usual. Thank you for making it this far in the video. We're getting close to the end of this series now, but fear not. I have plenty more ideas for series coming up immediately after this, so do subscribe and stay tuned for those if that interests you. At the moment I'm managing to put a video every Saturday. I do hope to eventually bump that up to 2 a week once I've sort of streamlined my process a little bit, but unfortunately life's just been like super busy right now, so it might still be a wee bit away before we can get those 2 a week. I've been loving all the comments you guys have been leaving, and I've actually been managing to read all of them and respond to most of them, so thank you guys very much for your thoughts on the series so far. If you have any suggestions for future series or just general feedback, please feel free to leave it down there, and I shall see you guys for another installment next Saturday.